For many investors, gold bars like these have become a refuge from political turmoil and shifting economic winds, especially in Washington.
Reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
In times of uncertainty, investors reach for gold. But this time, it's not just about buying more of it. The wealthy are rethinking where they stash their treasure. Away from traditional vaults in London and Geneva, and east to new hubs like Singapore.
Gold has surged past $4,000 an ounce, shattering every record ever set in global markets. But the story isn't simply about precious metals becoming more precious. It's about something deeper, more structural, and far more political. Around the world, the wealthiest individuals are moving their gold out of Western vaults and into Singapore. And this shift says more about Washington under Donald Trump than it does about the price of gold itself. Investors aren't running towards Singapore because it is fashionable. They are running because the United States no longer feels like the world's anchor of stability. When the people who control trillions quietly move their assets away from America, it is not a market trend. It is a warning. And while the U.S. seems increasingly unpredictable, Canada is being seen, perhaps for the first time in decades, as a nation that still knows how to behave like a safe, steady, rules-based democracy. In an age when unpredictability drives capital away, Canada's calmness is becoming an economic advantage.
The global elite are rebalancing where they store their wealth. Instead of London, Geneva, or New York, the new preferred destination for long-term precious metal storage is Singapore. Vault operators there report an influx of clients from the US, Europe, and Australia who want their gold held far from political storms, tariff wars, and currency uncertainty. Behind the scenes, this behavior reflects the same calculation repeated in financial circles from Zurich to Hong Kong. When American politics becomes volatile, investors stop assuming the US dollar will remain a flawless safe haven forever. The second Trump administration has introduced new risks into the global system, whether through sweeping tariffs, unpredictable trade interventions, or the constant threat of escalations that could disrupt global supply chains. These are not abstract scenarios. They shape how investors judge long-term safety. Singapore benefits partly because it offers what America no longer guarantees: consistency. No sudden policy swings. No economic nationalism. No tariff surprises announced at midnight. No fear that a government decision could wipe out a decade of planning. In simple terms, Singapore has become the new symbol of predictable governance, and that is exactly what people with generational wealth value most. The U.S. has long sold itself as the safest place on earth to hold money. For most of modern history, that was largely true. But Trump's second term has put serious cracks in that foundation. His trade war has escalated rather than stabilized. His tariffs have grown broader, not narrower. And his political style has turned economic policy into a form of performance, where sudden announcements and unexpected threats can shake markets overnight. This atmosphere affects investor psychology. When the world's wealthiest look at the United States, they now see the possibility of abrupt tariff hikes, currency retaliation, strained relations with allies, and a domestic political landscape so polarized that long-term policy planning becomes almost impossible. Markets can handle risks, but they cannot handle chaos. And right now, the U.S. feels much closer to chaos than calm. That is why the symbolic shift of gold from west to east matters. In finance, gold is the oldest form of insurance ever invented. It is what people hold when they stop trusting governments, currencies, or institutions. When gold leaves the United States, it reflects a belief that American political unpredictability has crossed a threshold. For the super rich, this is not ideological judgment. It is defensive strategy. This is where Canada enters the story, not because Canada is receiving the world's gold, but because Canada represents something increasingly rare in the Western world, a country that is stable, predictable, and governed with a long-term view. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is projecting the exact opposite image of Trump's America. Carney's background as a central banker shows in his approach. Policies are announced with caution, explained with clarity, and executed without drama. International investors notice this. Even in a year of global volatility, Canada has maintained a reputation for institutional strength. Its court system is predictable. Its banking sector remains one of the world's most resilient. Its trade strategy emphasizes diversification rather than confrontation, and its fiscal decisions avoid the extreme swings seen elsewhere. This does not mean Canada is immune from economic pressures. Like every nation, it faces inflationary challenges, high housing costs, and shifting demand in global markets. But while the U.S. responds to pressure with political brinksmanship, Canada responds with measured policy. That distinction matters enormously when global capital decides where to settle for the next generation. The contrast between the two neighboring countries grows clearer each month. One side of the border is governed by tariff theatrics and unpredictable executive orders. The other side is governed by steady financial management, trade diplomacy, and long-term planning. One country is fueling market fears. The other is quietly positioning itself as a stable economic counterweight. This contrast helps explain why analysts increasingly note that Canada could see indirect benefits from global capital flight. Not an explosion of gold shipments or dramatic inflows, but a gradual reevaluation among investors who ask themselves one simple question. If the United States continues on its volatile trajectory, where else in North America can I place long-term capital without constantly fearing political turbulence? The answer, for the first time in a long time, is Canada. Companies like Nokia, Toyota, Volkswagen, and major energy developers have already shown a willingness to expand in Canada whenever the U.S. becomes unpredictable. Investment houses in Europe note that Canada's sovereign bonds remain attractive precisely because institutions behave consistently. And in the Asian financial press, Canada is increasingly described as a medium-power safe haven, a country large enough to matter but stable enough to trust. Again, none of this implies a dramatic migration of the world's wealth into Canada, but it does mean that Canada's reputation is rising in relative terms. In a world reoriented by fear, steady countries gain value simply by staying calm. The global shift of gold storage towards Singapore marks the beginning of a wider story. It reflects a world where investors no longer assume the U.S. is automatically the safest place for their assets. It reflects a world where geopolitics shape financial decisions more than ever. And most importantly, it reflects a world in which stability becomes a premium commodity. Canada, by staying calm in a turbulent age, stands to gain credibility and influence. It does not need to compete with the U.S. directly or replicate Singapore's role in global finance. It simply needs to maintain the one quality the world's wealthiest people value most right now: predictable, sensible, long-term policy. If America continues down a path of volatility, the world's elite will keep diversifying their wealth away from Washington. And whether intentionally or not, Canada will become one of the few Western countries that investors see as a genuine alternative, a place where political storms are quieter, institutions are steadier, and the future feels less like a gamble.
We will fight for the auto workers. For us, it's extremely important that GM abides by its commitment, and a lot of Canadian taxpayers' money was involved. Now, it's time for you to be there for Canadians. And that's why we'll make sure that we work with the Detroit Three, so GM, Stellantis, and Ford.
Industry Minister Melanie Joly isn't offering polite diplomacy anymore. She's fighting to restart production at GM's Kami plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, and warning Detroit's auto giants that Canada will not be their dumping ground. In her national interview this week, Joly reaffirmed Ottawa's late October decision to cut tariff-free import quotas for GM and Stellantis, tying trade privileges directly to how much they build inside Canada. It's a bold move that comes just months after Donald Trump's 25% auto tariffs upended North America's car industry. And for once, Canada isn't reacting, it's striking first. In late October, the Department of Finance Canada slashed GM's tariff-free quota by roughly a quarter and Stellantis by nearly half after both firms scaled down production north of the border. The decision came just before Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled his first budget in early November, centered on a new Buy Canadian framework. The budget commits $186 million to prioritize Canadian suppliers and sets up a strategic response fund for sectors hit hardest by Trump's tariffs: steel, aluminum, and autos. The message, build here or pay more. GM's troubles began weeks earlier when it ended production of the Bright Drop electric van at Cami, citing weak EV demand. More than 1,400 workers lost their jobs and a billion-dollar project collapsed. Jolie gave GM 15 days to present a plan for a new model. As she meets with Unifor workers this month, Ottawa's stance is clear: GM owes Canada more than excuses.
For decades, Canada's auto industry operated as a quiet extension of Detroit's industrial heartland. That arrangement worked when trade was predictable. But Trump's return to the White House in 2025 and his so-called Liberation Day tariffs, ranging from 10 to 100%, tore that system apart. Carney's government is finished playing defense. The Buy Canadian initiative mirrors Washington's own tactics, turning economic pressure into leverage. If the United States uses tariffs to protect its factories, Canada will use its market to protect its workers. By connecting tariff-free privileges directly to local production, Ottawa has rewritten the rules of engagement. It's not anti-American, it's pro-Canadian. And this new posture arrives just as Trump's policies begin to backfire at home. According to Reuters, U.S. auto sales are projected to fall by nearly 1.8 million vehicles this year because of tariffs, with prices on popular SUVs and trucks climbing as much as 25%. The promise to bring jobs back is dissolving under the weight of higher costs and collapsing demand.
GM believed shuttering the Bright Drop line would be a quiet adjustment, a corporate efficiency move during a slowdown in EV sales. Instead, it detonated a political storm. The company's retreat from Ingersoll not only eliminated hundreds of skilled jobs, but also severed GM from a growing clean tech manufacturing ecosystem that Canada is determined to lead. Now, GM faces higher import duties on vehicles it sends north, restricted access to government contracts, and a major public relations problem in a country that once saved it from bankruptcy. During the 2008-2009 crisis, Canadian taxpayers poured billions into keeping GM alive. Jolie reminded executives of that history and made it clear, this time Canada expects loyalty in return. What GM didn't foresee is that the fallout is crossing back over the border. The Cami plant once supplied components for U.S. EV fleets. With that pipeline closed and Canada retaliating on import quotas, GM's logistics network is under strain. Dealers in Michigan and Ohio report delivery delays stretching into weeks. Component shortages are driving up costs and leaving empty spots on showroom floors. In trying to save money, GM has managed to lose efficiency, credibility, and supply stability. And the very country whose tariffs started this trade war, the United States, is now paying for it through higher prices and slower production.
Carney's first budget is more than a fiscal document. It's a declaration of economic independence. It links industrial policy and national security into one vision. Canada will no longer be a branch plant economy. Factories like Cami symbolize that mission, connecting clean energy, minerals, and manufacturing into a single supply chain. The new Strategic Response Fund is helping steelmakers in Sault Ste. Marie and Hamilton retool for EV production. If GM and Stellantis want to stay competitive, they'll need to invest alongside those Canadian partners or risk being replaced as Ottawa cultivates new investors from Asia and Europe. When Trump announced his sweeping auto tariffs in April, he boasted that it would bring industrial glory back to America. 7 months later, the data tell a different story. Supply chain disruptions are cutting North American output by roughly 20,000 cars a day, nearly a third of regional capacity. Ford and GM stocks are both down sharply since summer. Manufacturing job growth, once a campaign talking point, has now stalled for 3 straight months. By turning trade into a weapon, Trump has handed Canada a strategic opening. Ottawa's new industrial plan isn't reactionary, it's a counter-strategy. Canada is transforming crisis into leverage, using the shock of American protectionism to accelerate its own self-reliance.
The combination of Trump's tariffs and GM's withdrawal from Canada is feeding a feedback loop of failure. Without Canadian production, GM must import more components from Asia, exactly the supply chain Trump wanted to punish, which means even higher costs once tariffs apply. Those costs spill directly onto American consumers, who are now paying thousands more for mid-size EVs and delivery vans once assembled in Ontario. U.S. dealerships complain of shrinking inventories and unpredictable shipments. The broader North American supply web, once finely balanced, is now tangled in bureaucracy and border costs. Meanwhile, Canada is deepening partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the EU, redirecting investment that once flowed through Detroit. In trying to isolate competitors, Trump has effectively isolated his own producers. The fight over GM's CAM plant is more than a factory dispute. It marks the moment Canada stopped accepting the role of junior partner in North American trade. By cutting GM's and Stellantis' tariff-free privileges, the Carney government has shown that economic sovereignty can be exercised with precision, not bluster. For GM, the consequences are immediate. Either reinvest in Canada and restore trust with the workers who built its brand, or watch market share slip away to rivals eager to claim the space. For Trump, the lesson is harsh. His tariff war, launched in the name of American strength, is eroding the very industrial base he promised to rebuild. Canada's resurgence was sparked by Washington's aggression, but its future no longer depends on Washington's permission. Jolie's campaign to revive CAMI, backed by Carney's long-term industrial vision, signals a new chapter. Canada won't just endure Trump's tariffs. It will emerge from them stronger, more independent, and ready to rewrite the North American auto game.
Donald Trump says he doesn't want to see you at all at APEC. Has the Canadian government given any consideration to the possibility that he doesn't want to negotiate, and do you have a contingency plan for that?
We have yes. The short answer is yes.
Mark Carney didn't raise his voice or strike back. Standing before reporters in Kuala Lumpur, the Canadian Prime Minister responded to Donald Trump's latest outburst with quiet precision.
Obvious plan that is there in plain sight and will be further detailed in the budget on November 4th. And we have been saying this for months. I said this before I was elected. Emphasize the importance of us giving ourselves far more than any foreign government could take away, whatever the trading environment, and that's to build at home and to build strong at home.
Trump had just halted all trade talks with Canada after an Ontario television ad mocked his tariff policy. While Washington erupted in anger, Carney answered with a steady message. Canada would stay focused, build at home, and strengthen its global partnerships. It was a moment of contrast, emotion against restraint, reaction against reason. For Trump, the dispute was personal. For Carney, it was structural. He framed the pause in negotiations not as a loss, but as a reminder that leadership is measured by composure, not noise. That calm reply didn't just defuse confrontation, it marked the start of a larger shift, turning an American tantrum into an opening for Canadian independence. Carney's team had been close to a breakthrough. Officials on both sides were exchanging draft agreements aimed at easing U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Then, just as progress appeared within reach, the Ontario ad went on air across American networks. Trump reacted instantly. Negotiations were suspended and another 10% tariff on Canadian goods was threatened. He made no secret of his anger. Reporters asked Carney if he blamed Ontario's Premier Doug Ford for the setback. The Prime Minister didn't take the bait. Instead, he reminded the press that big negotiations often take unexpected turns, and that losing one round doesn't mean losing the game. His tone was deliberate, the opposite of Trump's. Where the U.S. president turned emotional, Carney turned strategic. By staying calm, he was signaling to both Washington and the Canadian public that Ottawa would not be dragged into a shouting match. Behind that calm surface, something larger was already taking shape. Canada was beginning to redefine how it would deal with the world.
During his media appearance, Carney repeated a phrase that summed up his entire economic vision. Canada must give itself more than any foreign government could ever take away. It was more than political reassurance, it was the outline of a national strategy, a plan to rebuild Canada's industrial base and shield it from unpredictable trade shocks. Carney revealed that his government would soon unleash hundreds of billions of dollars of investment at home, with details to be presented in the federal budget on November 4. This was not rhetoric, it was a clear signal that Canada would respond to trade aggression not with retaliation, but with reconstruction. In practice, this meant new funds for manufacturing, technology, and energy projects designed to make Canadian supply chains self-sufficient. Ottawa's approach contrasted sharply with Washington's. Trump used tariffs to punish competitors. Carney used investment to strengthen domestic capacity. The symbolism mattered. The U.S. tried to close doors. Canada began building its own foundation. What looked like an economic setback became the start of a national reset.
Carney's speech also revealed how deeply he understands the structure of North American trade. At one point, he pointed to aluminum, a product few outside the industry pay attention to, yet central to U.S. manufacturing. Canada supplies about 60% of the aluminum used by American factories. That metal is produced mostly using clean hydroelectric power from Quebec, which Carney said carries the energy equivalent of 10 Hoover dams. In other words, the U.S. benefits enormously by importing aluminum from Canada rather than producing it with its own fossil fuel electricity. By cutting off that supply, Trump's tariffs risk raising costs for American automakers, airplane builders, and construction companies, all industries that depend on Canadian inputs. Carney's point was clear. The U.S. and Canada are not rivals in this equation. They are two sides of the same industrial system. By targeting Canada, Trump was in effect taxing his own supply chain. This quiet economic logic cut deeper than any political statement could. It showed that leadership isn't about volume or emotion. It's about understanding how the system really works and knowing when to let the numbers speak for themselves.
As tensions with Washington rose, Carney's focus shifted eastward. In Kuala Lumpur, he met Malaysia's Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, his fourth ASEAN leader in just a few days. From there, he moved on to Singapore for meetings with business leaders before heading to South Korea for the APEC summit. While Trump was threatening new tariffs on allies, Carney was welcomed across Asia as a partner who valued stability. At the ASEAN summit, he announced that Canada aims to increase non-U.S. exports by 50% over the next decade, about $300 billion as part of its Indo-Pacific plan. He also confirmed a meeting with China's President Xi Jinping at APEC, the first between the two countries' leaders in 3 years. The talks would cover trade, technology, and the global economic system. Each stop sent the same signal. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington's approval. While the U.S. builds walls, Ottawa builds bridges, and much of Asia is ready to meet halfway. By the time Carney wrapped up his press events in Asia, the message had become unmistakable. Trump's trade war, once meant to project American strength, had instead weakened the country's leverage among its closest allies. For Canada, the fallout became an opening. Trump's anger gave Carney the space to present a different kind of leadership, one that combined patience with purpose. By focusing on long-term strategy rather than short-term politics, Canada began to emerge not as a victim of tariffs, but as a model of economic composure.
Analysts noted the irony. The U.S. tried to isolate Canada through tariffs, yet ended up isolating itself as Canada deepened ties with Asia and Europe. American firms still rely on Canadian energy, aluminum, and technology components, meaning any prolonged tariff fight hurts U.S. producers first. Carney reminded Canadians that progress had been made, that the door remained open, and that the best response to economic pressure was national resilience. The trade war revealed two opposing philosophies of power. One relies on anger and control, the other builds through stability and quiet confidence. When Trump halted talks, many thought it was a setback for Canada. Weeks later, it proved the opposite. Canada had turned crisis into strategy, using patience as leverage and composure as strength. The lesson is simple. When a trade war becomes a test of leadership, it is not the loudest voice that wins. It is the one that keeps building, even when others walk away.
Forget about President Trump. The guy drives me crazy. Let's focus on what we can do. We're going to continue growing, continue investing in the film industry. The film industry is very strong here. Let's start putting money back into people's pockets. Put money back into companies. Make it the most competitive area anywhere in the entire world.
In late September, Ontario Premier Doug Ford openly dismissed President Trump's proposed tariff on foreign films. Ford's message was blunt. Ontario has built a screen industry worth about $3 billion, with a clear ambition to grow to $5 billion. For him, the focus should be on expanding opportunity at home rather than chasing after disruptive policies south of the border. This clash over films might sound like a niche dispute, but it tells a larger story. Under Trump's second term, tariffs have become the centerpiece of U.S. economic policy, stretching far beyond steel, aluminum, or autos. From early 2025, Canada and Mexico face 25 to 35% duties on non-compliant goods. Europe agreed to a 15% ceiling on cars and parts, while China continues to face a 55% wall. Against that backdrop, the idea of taxing films is not an isolated measure. It fits a broader strategy of squeezing allies for leverage. Yet in this case, the cultural economy at stake does not respond the way traditional industries do. The problem begins with definition. In a globalized film economy, one project can be financed in Los Angeles, shot in Toronto, animated in Bangalore, and released worldwide. How do you decide which is foreign? In an era where streaming has eclipsed box offices, enforcement becomes murky. Would a platform pay tariffs on every series filmed outside the United States? Studios will adapt by rerouting production budgets to countries offering stability. Ford highlighted Ontario's response: create a competitive environment, cut taxes, and market local talent. With skilled crews and infrastructure, the province is ready to catch projects uncertain about U.S. policy. The industry already generates $3 billion and aims at $5 billion, positioning Ontario as a safe harbor if Washington creates confusion. Cultural tariffs rarely stay in isolation. Other countries have tools to retaliate, whether through quotas, subsidies, or promotional budgets that encourage global productions to avoid the United States. For U.S. distributors, a thinner pipeline of international content means fewer choices for consumers and higher costs without necessarily adding new American jobs. Meanwhile, Canada is pushing diversification. In the past year, Ontario attracted over $40 billion of investment across sectors, and Ford has emphasized growing ties with Europe and the United Kingdom. That same approach now applies to film. If U.S. trade walls rise, productions will not simply shrink, they will move. Toronto and Vancouver already host a large share of Hollywood shoots because of cost advantages and predictability. Adding political uncertainty in Washington only strengthens Canada's hand. For Trump, the short-term optics are powerful. A tariff on foreign films sounds like a bold defense of American culture, but the economic reality is less favorable. 3 scenarios emerge. If the tariff is fully imposed, international studios will gain the rules and shift even more spending to Canada or Europe, leaving U.S. job gains minimal. If the White House negotiates carve-outs, the symbolism remains, but most projects reroute through exemptions, weakening credibility.
If the policy is shelved under pressure, the uncertainty has already nudged productions to hedge their bets outside the U.S. In all three cases, the effect looks less like protection and more like acceleration of Canada's strategy. Ford's comments underscore that lesson. By focusing on building conditions for growth at home, Ontario turns a hostile policy abroad into fuel for expansion. The broader takeaway is clear. When tariffs target culture without clear definitions, markets adapt faster than politicians expect. Instead of restoring American dominance, the proposal risks backfiring by strengthening the very neighbor it was meant to pressure.